that thanks to the growing prosperity of even some of the poorest regions of the world, that was a huge overestimate. And it's now thought that it's going to peak at around 9 billion people in 2050. If we do not interrupt the march of the poorer countries towards prosperity by limiting CO2 emissions. That's a big if. If we do limit CO2 emissions, particularly in the poorer countries, if we also limit them in our countries to the point where we induce poverty here, then populations will rise worldwide as they become poorer or stay poorer, and that will lead to, in the end, a larger carbon footprint on the planet. The moral, therefore, is that while we have fossil fuels and we have several thousand years' supply, we should use them and use them now to get people out of poverty and misery and disease and death and into light and heat and hospitals now. And so then we'll stabilize the population and we won't have to use any of the population control measures advocated by the totalitarians such as Ehrlich.
Well done. Well done. Yes, gentleman up the back. Thank you. Yes. Yep, you're the man.
Thank you. An economic question for the panel. It's often suggested that Australia should not take action before the rest of the world. We should wait for the rest of the world to do something. My concern is that that is exactly what will happen. What happens if later this century China and India and Europe and America have gone and developed a whole lot of wind and solar power, a whole lot of tidal power technologies and renewable technologies, and we in Australia are forced to rely on the rest of the world to import our energy infrastructure? Why shouldn't we be developing this technology and leading the world? The country that has the energy advantage, the energy technology advantage, gets a much better place in the world economy. Why should we wait for the rest of the world to beat us to that?
Thank you. Lord Monckton has addressed that. Would you like to take that question?
I think so. Shall we let Tim Lambert therefore
have a go at it?
Yes, I think people like Lord Monckton think if we do something about it, he's just looking at the costs of reducing our reliance on fossil fuel without considering the benefits. And you're quite right, there are some really good benefits in terms of economic growth and opportunities for Australia to export technology and products to the rest of the world.
Right.
Yes.
I'm afraid that really isn't the case. Every economic analysis, read World Economics Passive, except that of Lord Stern, shows perfectly clearly that going to a so-called low-carbon economy is one of the most expensive and destructive courses of action you can take. Let's get that plain first of all. The next thing is alternative technologies. If you connect more than about 5% of your grid to wind power, and you get wind power from more than 5% of the grid, then you have to turn it off. And interestingly, in the Czech Republic, to quote this again, they've just had to turn off large amounts of solar and wind power because they've put too much on the grid and it's destabilizing the grid. Denmark has stopped subsidizing wind turbines for the same reason. It now tries to generate 20% of its electricity from wind. Most of the time it can't do that because either the wind's blowing not at all or it's blowing too much. And then they have to export a lot of their surplus wind power at very low rates, and even the subsidies are no longer enough to keep those wind turbines profitable. So the answer is that as fossil fuel prices rise, which they will eventually do as we use up more of them, at that point, and really only at that point, it becomes profitable and sensible to consider using alternative technologies. Governments picking winners by trying to subsidize technologies that at the moment are not only environmentally destructive, with wind turbines batting rare birds like ospreys and eagles in Scotland out of the sky, the griffon vultures in Navarre that led to the Spanish government closing down the largest wind farm in Europe because of the environmental destruction it was causing. Instead of doing that, we should wait until these things have been designed so that they don't do the damage to wildlife that they're doing at the moment, and until they become profitable in their own right, and that is a very, very long way from now. Otherwise, you merely put up everybody's electricity prices for no benefit to the climate whatsoever.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yes, the gentleman just in here. Young man with the cap on.
This is to the panel in general. Given that the continental plates are always shifting and the tectonic plates are always shifting, does this have any bearing on the sea levels rising or going down? Also, does the desalinate plants all around the world have any bearing on this? Or?
Thank you.
Yes, it does, but only over really, really long periods of time, like hundreds of millions of years, in terms of looking at what the climate's going to be like over the next 100 years, or even if we look back over a few million years, the continents don't move enough to make a significant difference.
Right, in fact, that's not quite right. The island of Lobnachara in the mouth of the Hooghly River, which had 10,000 people living on it, very suddenly disappeared beneath the waves just a few years ago, suddenly disappeared off the satellites. And what happened there was that there was a plate being subducted underneath the Himalayas, and it had pushed down the level of the sea so much there that the island went down with it, and it was glug, glug, glug. Nothing to do with global warming. So yes, you can get these local effects. Interestingly, there's been a local effect in Bangladesh, where we've actually had an increase in the land area of Bangladesh caused by large amounts of silt coming down and a slight rise in the level of the land, and also, I'm glad to say, a decline in sea level in that area. Professor Myrna went there recently and gave me quite a detailed report about it. So you're quite right that it makes these complications, these shifting of the plates, do indeed make it very difficult to try to get an accurate measure of mean sea level rise. So the way they try to do it now is using satellite altimetry against what's called a reference geoid, which is an idealized shape of what the sea ought to look like all the way around the world. And then you measure it against that and do complicated calculations to try to see whether sea level has gone up or down. That's certainly more accurate than the previous method using tide gauges, where the tide gauges themselves could be moved up or down if the land moved up or down. So these are some of the complexities. But there's another even more interesting one, and that is that in the Eastern Pacific Basin, where there is a lot of volcanic activity going on, a lot of shifting around of the plates just there, you get clusters of undersea earthquakes, which always seem to precede the El Nino events, which cause that strip of the equatorial Pacific to heat up suddenly, and that then gets picked up by the thermohaline circulation and goes all around the world. And that is almost certainly a volcanic effect that is happening, and happens intermittently every 3 or 4 years. So you can get these effects operating on quite short timescales, but of course on the much longer timescales, which Dr. Lambert is also rightly talking about, that's the kind of timescales in which, for instance, the Flinders Ranges have migrated from the equator via the South Pole and back to where they are now. And of course that does take hundreds of millions of years. A most interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. Thank you. Yes, yes, thank you. That gentleman up there? Yep.
Mine is a general question to both gentlemen. It seems to me that the measurement of a lot of these phenomena is at dispute. If you go to, say, Professor Linson's observations and papers about how much heat is radiated back into space, that sea level rise there is relatively accurate. What confidence have we got that you've got the equipment and technology in place to actually say, well, look, this, or believe the other? I'm a skeptic. I'm just as confused as probably half is here at least. Could both please comment on this?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Maybe Lord Monck can go first if he
Yes, all
understands
right.
it, and
I think the
I'll
question
see.
is actually a very reasonable one.